These days, our media is inundated with superheroes. It is almost impossible to escape the ubiquity of the genre. But this wasn't the case in the mid-2000s during the PlayStation 3 era. Infamous stood out because not only was it the rare good superhero game, but it was a new IP unto itself. Cole is an anti-hero in every sense of the word. He's as gruff as you'd expect for a male video game protagonist of the noughties, and this attitude is backed up by the game's morality system, which, binary as it is, allows you to make decisions that will lead to two distinct endings. You also gain powers dependent upon whether you decide to go down the good or evil path, adding further incentive to replay both these games. I've listed them both here as, similar to Tomb Raider, I think they sit equally in my mind. The first one was an obsession as I 100%ed the map, doing every side quest and finding every shard, whereas the second provides a vast upgrade in terms of the powers and set pieces. But at the core of why I adore Infamous so much is the traversal. If you've been following my taste in games thus far, you'll know that a good movement system is enough to sell me on a game. Infamous as a series has phenomenal traversal, using electricity as a means to grind on telephone lines, hover in mid-air, shoot in blasts, and a whole lot more. The city is a playground for these powers, as it is filled with collectibles and enemies, and the first game in particular is littered with shards that act as tiny dopamine hits every time you see one glinting on the horizon. This series is tremendous, and though I'm not as big a fan of Second Son, the first two games are personal, all-time classics. My first week with Fire Emblem Awakening was a blur. All I remember was waking up every day and playing it non-stop. It had been years since a Fire Emblem game had captured me, as Shadow Dragon on DS was such a disappointment. Awakening, though, was something special. Here was a game that looked fantastic, stepped up the production values, and celebrated Fire Emblem history so thoroughly. It's credited as the game that made the series successful for Nintendo, and you can see why. The marriage and pair-up mechanic, along with the ability to have limitless support conversations, emphasized a part of Fire Emblem that was barely at the forefront before. The split between classic and casual made it so much more approachable, and getting all the child units with the ability to pass down skills showed just how customizable characters could be. I personally loved it for the ease of play. This is hardly a challenging Fire Emblem game, and it gives you so many tools to over-level and grind your way to victory, but I love that about it. Just steamrolling my way through with partnered S-rank support units like Donal and Naui was tremendous fun, and despite the map design not being top-notch, the various environments really showed off what a 3DS Fire Emblem could do visually. It's a game I went back to well after rolling credits to keep grinding out skills and making overpowered child units, as well as recruiting various characters from Fire Emblem's past. It is the perfect entry point to the series, and the game that truly saved one of my favourite franchises. There will never be a 3D platformer as brilliant as these two games. At least maybe not for a few more decades. Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 are both incredible, so I couldn't not put them together. The first game was an eye-opening experience. I remember downloading videos from E3 2006 just to see crappy 240p footage of Mario Galaxy from the show floor, and I remember it blowing my mind. How could he walk upside down on planets like that? It seemed just magical. The gravity shifting mechanic made this game stand apart from what had come before, and began to get people discussing if Mario 64 had finally been topped. This is a game that I have 100%ed twice, and though there are some levels that will make you want to scream, you can't help but admire the constant variety and quality. Galaxy 2 then just did everything better. Of course you can't have the same impact as the original, but instead you can impress people with even more ideas. Cloud Mario, Yoshi, and a different approach to levels means that this game is not only beefier than the first, but is even more creative and challenging. To this day, I still haven't beaten the very final challenge, and it eats away at me. But I remember an afternoon where me and my friends spent 3 or 4 hours trying to beat it, and still had a great time despite our constant failure. What I'm saying is that the Galaxy games are what I think about when discussing modern video games that are undeniable all-time classics. It's hard to think they will ever be topped, but I'm sure Nintendo will try. Shovel Knight is iconic. I feel like I can say that with confidence now. There aren't many independent games that have risen to the heights of this juggernaut. His design screams NES, and in many ways he feels like a classic video game protagonist that could have easily stood alongside Mario and Mega Man in the late 80s. All that to say that Yacht Club are really damn good at what they do. Shovel Knight is one of the largest indie games ever made, partially due to their Kickstarter success, which meant adding free updates constantly. With 3 separate campaigns and an upcoming 4th, it is hard to argue with the value of Shovel Knight. But it is so much more than that. This adventure is filled with amazing level design and memorable moments. The soundtrack is Jake Kaufman at his zenith, with tracks that are complete earworms and will stick with you long after you roll credits. Yes, this game is overt about its influences. The 8 bosses of Mega Man, the overworld map of Mario 3, the side-scrolling towns of Zelda 2, and even the goddamn pogo jump from DuckTales. But the fact that it feels completely unique and has its own identity shows just how well Yacht Club drew on their favourite games without copy and pasting them. Every time they release a new update, I go back and remember why this game is so special. I honestly can't wait to see what they do next. You may consider this cheating, but quite honestly, this fan remake of Metroid 2 is better than the one Nintendo sanctioned. AM2R is what would have happened had Nintendo spent another couple of years with the GBA before moving on to the DS. It has the look and feel of both Fusion and Zero Mission, which in my mind is infinitely superior to the blurry 2.5D of the 3DS remake. This remake is in many ways more true to the original, while also adding many of its own twists. There are incredibly fun boss battles, new places where pieces of lore are stashed away, and an incredibly cool fast travel system that builds around the morph ball and the notion that you zip through tubes that interconnect the subterranean expanse. I remember spending a weekend blazing through this game when it was released and being on forums as people were mapping out where all the power-ups were hidden, even contributing to some of those maps myself. There isn't a whole lot to say, as technically I've already talked about this game on my list, but despite being a fan project, this really is one of the best games that I've played. I didn't grow up with A Link to the Past, and I'll spoil you right now, you won't find it on this list. I respect the hell out of that game, but despite it setting the formula for all future Zelda games up until Breath of the Wild, it doesn't quite hit the nail on the head when it comes to my favourite aspect of the Zelda series: puzzle solving. Link Between Worlds, however, is the sequel that changed everything. People always conflate these two games, and yes, they are set in the same world, but they are so vastly different in design. The ability to stick to a wall and become a painting is one of my favourite mechanics Nintendo has come up with in the last decade, right alongside the ink in Splatoon. It completely changes the way you think about traversal and finding secret areas. The rental system was a cool idea that ultimately didn't matter too much in the end. The game is so easy that you'll rarely die and risk losing the item, and they make rupees so plentiful that you'll be able to buy them all outright pretty quickly. However, the joy of Link Between Worlds is that it is a breezy experience. It runs at a flawless 60 frames per second, looks gorgeous in 3D, and has such a great momentum to its short dungeons. I struggle to name a Nintendo game that is more fluid than this one. When you commit to a Persona game, you live that Persona game. It just so happens that Persona 5 is a game that you can live for a very, very long time. Despite the fact that I beat every dungeon without taking in-game breaks in the calendar, and that I was playing on easy, it still took me 90 hours to get through this behemoth of an RPG. And my god, did that 90 hours feel like nothing at all. Persona is a series that has just locked in its hook. You have limited things you can do in a single day, and so you have to make choices about which characters you want to hang out with, which stats you want to improve, which places you want to visit. Because of these limitations, you want to keep playing. Go to the next day, and before you know it, it's 5 AM and you're balls deep in the next dungeon. The look and style of Persona 5 is unmatched, and its soundtrack is honestly top 5 of all time when it comes to video games. This synthesis of elements makes for an experience that is quite unlike any other. Many RPGs try to get you to care about its characters, only for them to fall short with tropey, uninspired attempts. And yes, there are tropes in Persona 5, there's anime influence all over this game, and yet there's a connection you create with these characters, bonds that are hard to describe, that really make you care about them all. It's hard to recommend a 100-hour game, but when it's as special as Persona 5, that barely matters. There is no series quite like Uncharted. Naughty Dog ushered in the era of cinematic storytelling in video games with this series, and to this day, no one does it better than them. I found it hard to choose which was my favourite in the series, so this is a tag team of Uncharted 2 and Lost Legacy, the two games which I feel best represent Uncharted at its peak. Fantastic pacing, amazing locations, gorgeous visuals, and great quippy character work that richens what is otherwise a fast, pulpy action-adventure story. Uncharted is built on a few solid foundations of gameplay, and if you were to pigeonhole it into a genre, you'd likely land on third-person shooter. But this series is so much more than its gunplay mechanics. It relishes in giving you variety constantly, be that fighting on the back of a train, exploring an open hub in a jeep, or clambering up an ancient structure that is falling to pieces in the most bombastic way possible. The action set pieces of this series are hard to top, alongside the fact that you care deeply about these characters. It makes that peril, danger-free as you ultimately know it is, feel much more real. And that really is the core of why Uncharted lands higher on my list than the rebooted Tomb Raider games. These characters are fantastic, and they grow. Across the series you see a progression for Nathan, Elena, Sully and their friends. They change significantly, and the tensions in their relationships are so well portrayed by top-tier voice talent. Uncharted 4 wraps up in a way that feels not only natural, but fully earned. I feel like it will be a while before the series comes back, but for what Naughty Dog achieved, these really are some of the finest experiences ever crafted in the medium. Sony Santa Monica did what no one else in the Sony first-party stable could do. They made a better game than even Naughty Dog. 2018's God of War is a triumph on so many levels. I remember a moment after visiting Alfheim in the game's opening hours and thinking, am I really going to go to all 9 of these realms and spend as much time there as I did here? Because if that's the case, this game is enormous in a way I can't even imagine. Ultimately, that didn't prove to be the case, but what it underscores is that this team didn't just create a game, they molded a world. One where your imagination cannot help but lust at the possibilities. I think that the allure of the Norse setting was what really sold me. These gods and the locations they reside in are not only stunning, but laced with mythology and history that is even more tantalizing and intriguing than the stories and myths of the classical world from which Kratos hails. And Kratos really is at the heart of this story. A character some thought was irredeemable, and nothing more than a caricature, turned out to be one of the most nuanced and complex characters in the last decade of video games. The Leviathan axe also cements its place as an iconic weapon that feels amazing to wield, whether in Kratos' hands or thrown as a projectile that you can call back whenever it pleases you. This weapon not only elevates an incredibly satisfying combat system, but is used scrupulously in environmental puzzle solving, leading to some of my favourite moments in the game. God of War truly is a remarkable achievement, and it sets the groundwork for what could be one of the greatest trilogies in video games. Jump and shoot. It's the foundation of some of the best games ever made, and Cuphead is exactly that. One of the greatest games ever made, that is. The best thing about Cuphead, though, is not in fact the thing that got everyone talking about it in the first place. The gorgeous cartoon-inspired visuals are to this day mind-blowing in their adherence to a style and their effectiveness in conveying exaggerated animation to the player. However, it is the design of these bosses, their moves, the stages on which you fight them that is the real genius of Cuphead. There is inspiration all over this game, and yet the influence it shows most clearly isn't Disney, but rather Contra, a series that is known for its infamously ludicrous difficulty and unforgiving boss fights. Cuphead then succeeds in creating a Contra-style game for the modern era. Not only are run-and-gun levels extremely sparse, as they aren't the main focus of the game, they don't end in nightmarishly hard boss fights. Instead, Cuphead cuts straight to the chase, with most of the game comprising the boss fights themselves, meaning that you always have motivation to pick the controller back up after losing. The post-fight visualization of how far you got with the flag indicating the end is a masterstroke and helps to motivate those who otherwise may give up. Learning Cuphead's bosses and their various intricacies is one of the most enjoyable challenges I've faced playing video games. Going from overwhelmed and not thinking you're going to be able to beat it, to mastering every attack and not even getting hit, the hill you climb through practice and determination in Cuphead is undeniably satisfying. This is to speak nothing of the wonderful soundtrack and sound design, both of which brilliantly capture the aesthetic that this game strives for. There are few games that I can say are a resounding success on every front, but Cuphead certainly is.